Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe, and we are back with another innovator interview. Today, we're going to be talking about plastic, which is a convenience that has turned into a plague. According to a recent report by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, plastic consumption has quadrupled over the past 30 years, and plastic production currently accounts for 3.4% of annual greenhouse gas emissions. Only 9% of plastic waste is recycled globally. 6.1 million tons of plastic escape into freshwater environments, and 1.7 million tons reaches the ocean each year. Plastic is in our water, our soil, our food, and our bodies. Last year, the plastics-pact, a group of about 100 companies, non-governmental organizations, and governments, introduced a roadmap for transforming the plastic recycling infrastructure by 2025. Their goal is to recycle 30% of plastic annually by mid-decade. We're joined today by Dr. Anja-Malawi-Brandon, an advisor to the Plastics-Pact and U.S. policy analyst for the Ocean Conservancy. Her doctoral research examined how to degrade plastics efficiently, and we're looking forward to discussing several recent plastic-related events, including the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which is in Congress for the third time this year, and the just-started meeting in Nairobi, Kenya, of the UN Environmental Assembly to negotiate a global plastics treaty that could introduce a framework for changing our relationship to the material. You can learn more about the Ocean Conservancy at Ocean Conservancy, one word, oceanconservancy.org, and about the Plastics-Pact at US Plastics-Pact, all one word, usplasticspact.org. Welcome to the show, Anja. How are you today?
I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. I am really excited to be here.
Well, thank you for joining us. And, you're doing a lot of important work. Plastic is certainly something that we have to come to terms with and utterly redefine our relationship with. Tell us about the Plastics-Pact and its roadmap. What are the keys to success in reaching the kinds of recycling and compostability and recovery rates that the organization is targeting?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. That's a great question. I think taking one step back, we need to think about, what is the bigger picture that we're trying to solve for here, mm-hmm. and how do we get there? And ultimately, the science is incredibly clear. We need a holistic approach to solving the plastic pollution crisis that's going to involve both reducing the amount of plastic we produce and use, and also increasing the amount of plastic we can reuse through recycling. As you listed off a bunch of ways that plastic is impacting our lives already, and we could go on for the entire podcast just talking about that. But when we think about where to go next in redefining our relationship with plastic, we need to think about how we transition to a circular economy. And the Plastics-Pact, the U.S. Plastics-Pact, has defined these 4 targets to, kickstart our transition there. So we brought together a bunch of companies, NGOs, governments, just like you said, to kind of drive innovation and push policy as well.
So what do those policies need to focus on? What are the key levers that we have to push that we can change how we handle plastic throughout its entire life cycle?
Great question. So some of the levers that we can push is helping redrive innovation and redesign the plastics that we're using. Mm-hmm. One of the problems with recycling is we have so many plastic products on the market. It is hard for consumers and recyclers alike to sort out what goes where.
Sure.
So there's not going to be one silver bullet to fixing the plastic pollution crisis or just our recycling system. But we really need to start by looking upstream at all of those different plastic packaging and products and redesign them to be more circular. And that really means first taking a step back and asking, do we need that plastic packaging in the first place? Is that just a convenience that we're used to, or is that actually serving a purpose? If it's serving a purpose, does it need to be plastic? Can it be a more sustainable, recyclable alternative, even a more sustainable, recyclable plastic? And if it, how can we make that more recyclable? How can we label it clearly so that we understand what to do with that product when we're done with it? And we also need some of those downstream improvements, in our actual recycling system, how we collect, sort, and, mechanically recycle our plastics. And that's going to take, infrastructure improvements and innovation as well. And it's important in thinking about all of those improvements that are down the line. Who's going to be responsible for that? Is that burden going to be on you and I as taxpayers and ratepayers, or is it going to be shifted to the plastic producers who are actually making all of that waste that we have to deal with?
So we can simplify the packaging that we use. We can invest in and improve the infrastructure that we have available to us, and we can certainly spend a lot of time educating people. I mean, that's what we do at Earth911 every day, trying to help people understand where stuff goes. But there's this overarching challenge of we have become so used to the presence of plastic in our lives. How do we rethink our relationship with plastic at a fundamental level as individuals? Should we be rejecting more plastic? And if so, how do we send that message back into the production system that gives us so much plastic in the first place?
That is a great question. And I think in many ways, individual action is very similar to when we're thinking about climate change. Individual action can seem really daunting against such a huge, monumental societal issue. That does not mean that individual action is not important. There are totally things that we each can do to reduce our plastic footprint, elect different packaging alternatives, switch to reusables. But really the most important individual action we can take is telling our policymakers at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, that we're pretty fed up with this and that we want to see change. And we can also tell our, producers that, and retailers. And, that one you can either reach out directly or, speak with your wallet and how you choose to buy things or not buy things. We've seen really successful, grassroots level action there where people elect not to use straws or plastic bags, and we see that lead to the policy change that we need.
Now, the plastics-pact is also one of the first deliverables in its project is a list of plastic packaging that it considers unnecessary. What's on that list? Some of it's materials that are part of plastic or a component of plastic, such as rigid clamshells, and others are entire categories of plastic, like cutlery, straws, and drink stirrers. How do we use that list and make some decisions as individuals about what we should be buying? And how are the industry players reacting to this list? Are they getting on board to reduce the use of those materials?
Absolutely. This list fundamentally includes 11 materials that are non-reusable and non-recyclable. That was our first criteria in creating this list. If you could be reused, if you can be easily recycled, we said that's totally fine. You can continue in a circular economy. The 11 materials identified here aren't, and instead they end up contaminating our waste streams and worse, contaminating our environment. So this, as you pointed out, includes some, whole categories of plastics like polystyrene. Think of your packing peanuts or foam coffee cups, where it's really not economically feasible to recycle. They're really lightweight. They escape into the environment where it breaks up into these small foam pieces. And these small foam pieces are actually the most commonly collected microplastic in our international coastal cleanup every year. And it, includes kind of whole product categories, right? Straws, stirred cutleries. Nearly 2 million forks, knives, and spoons have been collected out of over the last 35 years in the international coastal cleanup. So these things are kind of everywhere in our environment. That being said, is it going to be easy to phase them out? Not necessarily. We have come to be pretty used to them. The big difference here with the pact organizing around this is that we have about a third of the packing industry aligned around this list. That's critical mass to drive collaborative action, to think through what are ways we can replace this. Do we need to replace this in the first place? And how can we do the type of education needed to tell consumers, you're not going to get a straw or stirrer anymore, but that's okay. You can bring a reusable one if you want.
Or here's a compostable alternative. But are they actually stopping making these materials, or are they endorsing the idea people should use less? How committed are they to changing their business?
Right. That's kind of the critical question. This is a voluntary action through the pact. It does come with some pretty stringent reporting requirements, so the pact can, hold itself accountable. The goal of the pact is that these 11 materials will be phased out, so absolutely eliminated by the pact members by 2025. And of course, it's also our goal that this helps spearhead stronger innovation. There's already so much buy-in from major industry players here. That's one less hurdle for policymakers to overcome to take this from ambitious voluntary action to a policy mandate.
So the second major goal of the roadmap is to get to 30% recycling of plastic by 2025, which seems like a real stretch since we're only recycling about 9% today. And one of the interesting points in the OECD report that I mentioned in the introduction is that 40% of the plastic materials collected ends up being sent to landfill or incinerated because of contamination. How do we have to change the collection and recycling infrastructure to achieve these levels of recycling?
The average contamination rate in our U.S. recycling system is about 25%. So that means that 1 out of every 4 things we put in our recycling system can't end up being recycled.
Right.
So not surprising that we struggle to collect enough recycled material to sell it back, or we struggle to have really good recycled content coming out of the other end because we have all this other stuff in there. And I think that gets back to what we were already talking about with just the sheer number and volume of different types of plastic packaging and products that we're putting on the market and saying, not saying to consumers, here is what can go in the recycling bin and here is what absolutely cannot. So to get to your question here, how do we change this? We need to start by looking upstream again, as we talked about, thinking through the plastic packaging that's going to be on the market, simplifying, reducing where possible. There's plenty of low-hanging fruit there of, hey, maybe we don't need this covered in plastic. And then it's going to take a lot of improvements in how we collect and sort our recycling. We have new technology coming online for recycling in terms of sorting and being better able to have a really clean recycling stream, but it's expensive. And the burden really shouldn't be on you or I in paying for our plastic recycling to get picked up every month to pay for that if we don't have better alternatives. The burden really should be back on producers who are putting all of this stuff into the market without internalizing any of those downstream costs.
So we have talked with a number of different plastics companies on this show, and they generally estimate when we ask the question, how much of their revenue should they be allocating to recycling, between 1.5 and 2%. Do you see members of the Plastic Pact starting to think in terms of exercising or creating their own extended producer responsibility programs to support improved collection?
I'm so excited that you have talked to a lot of plastic producers about this. And that's really interesting. I actually haven't heard those specific revenue percentages before. In terms of extended producer responsibility, the pact has come out. We have a working group that thinks about policy. They can't suggest anything to Congress necessarily, but they kind of internally think about what are best practices, and extended producer responsibility is number 1 on that list. That is what we all agree it's going to take to fix this problem. I think beyond voluntary extended producer responsibility, we need to set mandates. We need to use policy to hold these producers accountable because maybe it takes more than 1% or 1.5%. I don't know the math there on the top of my head.
Sure.
But if it's 2% or 3% or 4%, we absolutely need producers to kind of pay up and help make sure that their products are actually moving all the way through the system.
So earlier in the conversation, you did point out how complicated our recycling system is. We have municipal, county, state, and federal level programs and guidelines. You've worked with Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon on the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, which has been introduced in 3 successive sessions of Congress. Is that bill going to bring some sort of rational national approach to plastic into being? And what are the prospects? It has not moved very far in the previous 2 sessions.
That is a great question. And you are absolutely spot on. We have a really complicated system. I believe by last count, there's almost 10,000 different recycling systems between those state, local, municipal programs you were just addressing. So yeah, some unification there would be pretty nice for us consumers to be able to understand what the heck we're doing with our recycling. In terms of the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act, it has been reintroduced with more co-sponsors than ever. It continues to collect congressional support, which is always exciting and a great sign. That being said, it's not necessarily an easy Congress to move these types of big legislation. And by all accounts, the Break Free Act is certainly a big piece of legislation. It is the most comprehensive bill ever introduced to address this plastic pollution crisis. I think really importantly, in thinking about that bill in particular, nothing is radical. It just brings together the best practices that have been working at the local and state level across the country or in other countries. You know, we are absolutely not the first place to be grappling with this plastic pollution issue. And we have plenty of peer countries that we can look to and see, how are you addressing this? What can we be doing better? And the answer there tends to be extended producer responsibility. I think
which a few states have implemented, including Washington State, where I am. Do you see a movement in state legislatures to adopt extended producer responsibility regulation?
So more than just a few states have adopted some form of extended producer responsibility. There's tons of programs out there, whether it's battery buybacks or carpet or mattresses or paint. There's tons of models for this type of work. In terms of states that have addressed this specifically in terms of packaging and plastics, really 2 states have, right. Oregon and Maine. And so I think we are waiting to see how it goes in those states, learning those best practices. And ultimately, we do need to apply it at the federal level. And I think industry wants that. There's nothing probably more complicated for them than a patchwork system of extended producer responsibility where you have to report something to Oregon, but you don't have to report it to Maine, and you have to report both things to Washington. That's a headache on their part.
Absolutely.
Having one federal system is going to be really important. And I think the more states we get talking about extended producer responsibility, introducing it, I think there's been nearly a dozen states this legislative cycle that have introduced this type of bill, the more excitement and momentum we're going to have at the federal level.
So the other major policy event that I wanted to ask you about is the discussion beginning in Nairobi about a global plastics-pact. And can you outline what the conversation is about so that our listeners can get up to speed on it? And do you see willingness in the U.S. Senate to approve a treaty like that?
Right now in Nairobi, actually last week essentially in Nairobi, countries from around the world got together to decide, how are we going to deal with this issue globally? How are we going to work together to address the fact that, plastic from one country can end up in another country because we have a really complicated ecosystem. Ocean currents move plastic around, right? No one country can address this single-handedly. Again, thinking of climate change, we have the Paris Agreement equivalent. So these countries got together on the idea of essentially the Paris Climate Agreement, but for plastics. And we were really excited to see that the negotiators in Nairobi this past week agreed on a mandate for a legally binding international instrument. Mm-hmm. And that's a huge step forward, right? This is a testament to years of work that have gone into these kind of laborious international diplomacy processes. The U.S. is not the only country that faces potential challenges with ratifying a treaty. Yes, our Senate can be a complicated system to move through, but we're not alone in that challenge, which is why I think the negotiators have agreed to binding elements of this, non-binding elements, giving countries flexibility to adjust their commitments, kind of like the Paris Accord. Mm-hmm. Taking into account where people are, what they can do, and how we really make progress on this as soon as possible. So not having to wait for countries to go through that ratification process.
So as I've read about what the conversation in Nairobi will focus on, it seems like there's two major themes or strategies that are potentially at odds but need to come together in order to find a way forward. And one is that to focus on the whole life cycle, look at each step in the process and the impact of plastic on lives and the environment, and try to manage those as point problems. And then the other is to take a more infrastructure-centric approach that says we're going to put regulations in place to control what goes into the system and what is processed and reused. Are there areas of commonality between those two different approaches to the problem of managing plastics' impact on us in our world, that they're going to be able to find a bridge to create that agreement?
Yeah, I think you captured kind of the two approaches really well. Going into Nairobi, there was our life cycle approach, and then kind of more of the downstream, how are we going to manage what ends up in the environment approach. And what we were able to see coming out of Nairobi is a resolution that recognizes we need to address that full life cycle of plastic. Mm-hmm. It doesn't necessarily go into all the specifics of how we get there. That's the work to come over the next 2 years, really. But we're really excited to see that recognition that we can't just work on what's coming out. We can't just work on infrastructure. We need to also be thinking about the rest of the plastics life cycle, the production of plastic that contributes to global warming and environmental justice issues, the end-of-life management from how we recycle it to how it ends up in the environment. So this is really exciting that they came together around one approach. And I think ultimately the thing that bound these two groups together was a shared value of a science and evidence-driven approach. And the science is just really clear that is what it's going to take to address this plastic pollution crisis.
So thinking about what you've just said and looking at the 2 years of negotiation that we are still going to have to go through before there is an actual agreement, are countries and companies going to be committing budget to supporting these investments in managing the life cycle of plastic? And does that mean that the U.S. is going to have to agree to put money into a global kitty? And do you feel like the U.S. is ready to do that?
This question absolutely gets to really the core challenge here and what's to come. The mandate coming out of these talks in Nairobi is pretty broad. Mm-hmm. So as negotiations really dig in and take place over the next 2 years, there's a few of these issues that we'll really need to narrow in on. Again, making sure that it stays the full scope of the problem, addresses the entire plastics life cycle, and that there's adequate financial support and capacity to ensure that all of the countries involved can undertake, equally ambitious strategies. What that means in terms of how much dollars and cents from each country needs to flow into a global pot or comes directly from state to state giving, I think remains to be seen. What we do know is that the U.S. is the top contributor of plastic waste and historically has been as high as the third contributor, the third most contributor to plastic pollution entering our aquatic ecosystem. And we have a lot of responsibility for this problem, and we should and need to take ownership of that.
If only we would do that.
Exactly, right? That's going to be the real crux of this. And I'm really excited that the current administration is at the table listening to stakeholders internationally, but also, right here at home to figure out how to make it work the best they can.
So how can our listeners follow along both on the progress in Congress with the Break Free from Plastic Pollution Act and the Nairobi Agreement? What do you suggest they track as they watch the future be negotiated?
Great question. I think starting with Ocean Conservancy and following us on social media and online is a great place to start. We have a bunch of really informational blogs that we put up that are quick reads, kind of quick hits of what's happening in the world and what's most important to our members. Beyond that, this issue remains in the news almost constantly. And I'm really excited by that because I think the more people thinking about it and reading about it, the more action there is that's going to happen. Getting involved at the state and local level can be a lot easier than I think we all think. It can be as simple as writing a letter to your local representative or your local senator in state house, or it could be going in person or attending virtually if there's these types of meetings happening. There's plenty of ways to plug in and make your voice known at the local level. Those actions are just as easily taken at the federal level. Having worked for Senator Markley, we met with everyone from Oregon that was interested in talking about anything really. Our doors were always open to hear from people in our state, and most members of Congress have that same open door policy. So if this is an issue that's important to you, there's plenty of ways to, Google your state or local or federal representative. There's almost always a website with a how to connect with us. You can email them, you can call their office and try to set up an appointment. And then there's through Ocean Conservancy and I'm sure other NGOs as well, we make it really easy to take simple actions. So we have pre-written action alerts essentially that we can tell you, hey, this is a really good moment to plug in. You can follow along with those both on social media and on our website.
Well, thank you for taking time to talk with us today, Anja. I really appreciate it. Now, we will, of course, include a pointer so people can sign up to follow along at the Ocean Conservancy.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was a wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you for joining us. We've been talking with Dr. Anja-Malawi-Brandon, who is an advisor to the Plastics-Pact and the U.S. policy analyst for the Ocean Conservancy. You can find out more about the Ocean Conservancy at the oceanconservancy.org. Ocean Conservancy is just one word, no dash. And you can also check out the Plastics-Pact at usplastics-pact.org. Also, all one word, U.S. Plastics-Pact with no dashes. This is Earth911 Sustainability in Your Ear, and I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. We're always pleased to have you listen in on these conversations with thought leaders from around the world. And we hope that you'll take a few minutes to learn about the Break Free from Plastics Pollution Act, which is currently in Congress. It's sponsored by Senator Jeff Merkley of Oregon. as well as the new conversation just beginning in Nairobi, Kenya, about the Global Plastics Pact. And both of these are critically important policies that are going to drive radical changes in our relationship with plastic. And it will not happen soon enough. So get involved and help to push this through. Tell your representatives that you support increased investment in recycling infrastructure for plastic, for extended producer responsibility laws that will require that the companies that inject plastic into our lives take responsibility for that material, and take the time to learn how and where and when to put your plastic. Sort it well and help us do a better job of keeping this planet healthy and sustainable. We're going to be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, I hope you'll take a few minutes to share this and other podcasts that we've done with your friends, family, and loved ones. Let's all start thinking about more ideas in order to produce less waste. We'll be back soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.